Welcome, everyone. My name is Laura Daly, and I'm a member of the Roundtable Committee. We thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home event. Jim Gaines's latest book, The 50s, An Underground History. For those of you not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City. Our mission is to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. To that end, the club offers over 150 free programs annually to the public. These programs include exhibitions, theatrical, musical, and dance performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, please visit nationalartsclub.org. And you can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. The 50s, An Underground History, will be available as of February 8th. You can pre-order the book from our preferred independent bookseller, Books on Call NYC, via the link that we will be sharing in the chat. There will be a Q&A session after this presentation, so I encourage everyone to use the Q&A function for any questions that you may have. This program is being recorded and will become available tomorrow on our YouTube channel. The 50s, An Underground History, is author Jim Gaines's challenge to the myth of the 50s being a decade of conformity. He recognizes the solitary, brave, and stubborn individuals behind radical gay rights, feminism, civil rights, and environmental movements. Mr. Gaines is an historian and former editor of Time, Life, and People magazines. His other books include Evening in the Palace of Reason, a study of J.S. Bach and the Early Enlightenment, and For Liberty and Glory, Washington, Lafayette, and Their Revolutions. Jim will be interviewed by Bill Goldstein. Bill reviews books and interviews authors for NBC's Weekend Today in New York, and was the founding editor of the New York Times Books website. Bill is also an author. He is currently writing a biography of Larry Kramer to be published by Crown, and worked on this book as a 2019-2020 fellow at the Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Jim Gaines and Bill Goldstein.
Thank you, Laura, very much. That was a wonderful introduction. And Jim, thank you so much for writing this book. I loved it and learned so much, and am eager to, I hope, get as much of it as we possibly can into the conversation tonight. I hope we'll leave a little out just so people have a real reason to read and to buy this book, because it is wonderful and you bring attention to so many people who most people will not necessarily be familiar with. So I want to talk about what inspired you to look at the 50s. I mean, I think you tell the story that you were talking to one of your children about the 1960s, and that got you thinking of what was going on in the 1950s. So if you could just give me a little bit of background on how this book came about, and then we'll talk about the people that you choose to focus on.
I had just finished the Washington and Lafayette book, and as authors do, I was looking for another subject. And when my son said what he said about the 1960s, I thought, why were the 60s such a sharp departure from the 1950s? Because history just doesn't work that way. It doesn't work by decade. And so I started looking in the 50s for the root of the 60s and found a lot more roots than I thought there were. A lot more isolated people. I mean, Norman Mailer said about the 50s that it was a time of convention, that people had lacked courage, and they were too much committed to work with each other in a very kind of anodyne spirit. And what I found was that there are people who are in every decade, at all times, there are people who are making change, whether they're making change as a part of a movement or as a celebrity or as a politician. It is usually people, at least in the 50s, it's usually people who have a specific problem that they're trying to solve in their own lives. And that's what I found on the major movements of the 1960s: gay rights, civil rights, feminism, and ecology. Each of them had very conflicted champions, and I thought that was a special story about the 1950s.
Well, it's wonderful how you connect the social change, political and social change, to the, as you say, the individual struggles of particular people. Obviously, there were other people who were suffering through the same personal changes that these particular people inspired or drew to them, and you make that very clear. But let's talk, I mean, going through the book in the order that you present these movements. I mean, first you begin with the LGBT rights movement. But before we get to that, I do want to say something about how you link this very effectively, the change of the 50s and then further change in the 60s, to the cataclysm of the atom bomb, really. I mean, and then the sort of the universal change that brought in the way that people conceived of the fragility of their own lives and of life on Earth. I mean, and so that underpinning of change that seems to make people impatient with impatient with their own doom, perhaps, and then they just realize, I can't live like this anymore, and I need to be happy in the here and now. But so you link it to that, and then also to changes in the arts with Allen Ginsberg writing and the Beats. And I love what you say, that the call to spontaneity in the arts spoke to a spirit of defiance whose more costly enactments were social and political. So that's the background of, now we'll come to some of the people. The gay rights movement, some of the progenitors of this, and the one that you in particular focus on first, is Harry Hay. So if you could tell me a little bit about Harry Hay, and then how you draw in Franklin Kameny and Barbara Giddings into what Harry Hay was really feeling, and then how it connected out to other people all across the country who were feeling that same way.
Harry Hay was a very deeply conflicted man. During World War II, he did not want to go into the military because he was afraid his homosexuality would make him a sacrificial figure, because at the time in World War II, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany shared the same view of homosexuality, that it was a psychopath disease, that it was wicked, that it was sinful, and it was punishable by long terms of imprisonment. And it's interesting that I can't think of another social idea with which all those three combatants were agreed, other than this one. Harry Hay was working in a defense factory, which won him an exemption from the draft. But he had been married to a woman he met in the Communist Party. He was a member of the Communist Party. And they had two daughters. And suddenly in about 1946, 47, he entered what he called his period of terror, when he was thinking about how do I reconcile this conflict? I'm not living the life of who I actually am. And he was far from alone in that. And during this period of terror, he had nightmares about leaving his wife and children, about hurting them, about falling down mountainsides. I mean, it was a terrible time for him. And you can see in his family album the sadness and the irresolution that he was going through at the time. In about 1948, he got more serious about this. And again, it was the worst possible time. And he was alone with this idea for at least 2 years. He went to parties to try to get people to sign up. At one point, he went to a beach near Los Angeles, which is where he lived, with a petition that was against the Korean War, but also to sign up for a Mattachine Society, which is what he called it, meeting. And he got lots of people. He thought signing up for a peace petition against Korea would be impossible to get a signature from anybody for, but that they might put their name to the Mattachine Society. He found exactly the opposite. They were happy to sue for peace, but they were not happy to sign their names. Of course they weren't. Homosexuals then were being fired from the State Department right and left, hundreds of them. And as I said, it was just a time when being gay was criminalized.
Right.
So why would you? And not only criminalized, but all gays in government were suspected traitors because they were blackmailable. And so why would a bunch of men sign up for a group that would identify them as potential traitors and worse? So he went through that until about 1951 when he had a real organization going. And then at their first convention, he was thrown out because he was a communist. It's hard to imagine at this time, but there was a time, especially during the Depression and after, when communism had it said a lot of good things to the world. It said especially to the United States and Europe. It said they have overthrown the elite. They're giving the rights to labor and peasantry that they never had before. It's a new government by, for, and of the people, which was in a sense more truly that than even the United States. So I think you have to forgive people who were in the U.S. Communist Party in the 1930s, because it did seem like such a wonderful contrast to what we were going through, and not to mention the fact that the Soviet Union had thrown out their financiers, their elite rich, when ours were minting fool's gold in the 1920s and getting rich at the expense of their fellow Americans.
So, I mean, you paint this very clear picture of their hopes. I mean, and I want to talk eventually about Paulie Murray and other people that you talk about. But one of the things is the way in which you make very clear, you alluded to it at the beginning, that what become political ideas and what become political movements are really begin as a fight for what you call a change as part of a daily struggle with themselves, and that they could not or would not tolerate the injustices they saw in American society, but it was really about the burden that placed on them. I mean, about their identities, about their daily lives. And so the connections that they began to make with what society demanded and the, I guess, inconsistencies in who they were in terms of what was expected. And so with Harry Hay, I mean, he's a married man, but he has these homosexual impulses, which he knew about and which his wife even knew about when they got married. Or you have Paulie Murray, who I want to talk about, who you bring into in both the feminist movement and also obviously in race relations, who was a Black woman, a lesbian. I mean, who was not necessarily ill at ease in her skin, but was comfortable in her skin against the constraints that society put on her. Like, she seemed to know who she was, even though society didn't want to recognize who she was. So if you could talk about how they took this sort of kind of personal understanding and made it, we can talk about the feminists that you bring in.
Yeah, Paulie Murray, she wasn't at the beginning okay about who she was. She was conflicted in many different directions. One of them was gender and sexuality. And she wasn't a lesbian per se. She thought she was a man. And she wrote doctors with passionate, really upsetting to read even now, letters saying, you've got to help me. I know that there's something wrong with me physically because I'm a man. I'm not a woman. I'm not female. I am male. And of course, the doctors all said, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can find or even conceive that would cause you to feel that way. At the same time, she was well, let me go back a bit. Her mother died when she was 3 years old. Her father, who had had many fits of insanity, was committed to a mental hospital. She was sent to live with relatives in the South, who were also very starkly unalike. Her grandfather had fought in the Civil War on the Union side, and her grandmother was the child of a slave who had been raped by the two sons of her owner. And so Cornelia was proud of the fact that owner could afford 30 slaves. And she thought there was something really kind of cool about the Confederacy. Both her grandparents were light-skinned, and Paulie Murray was a little bit darker than they were, but also light-skinned. And she talked about her in-between life. In a world of black-white opposites, she said, I have no place. And so that was one of her disjunctions. Another was her gender. And another was discrimination against her because she was female. And that happened mainly at Howard Law School.
Within the civil rights movement, within the Black community, she was discriminated against as a woman.
Yes, exactly. At Howard, she was the only woman in her all-Black class at law school. And she was laughed at behind her back. She was called in class. And finally, she was told she couldn't belong to a legal fraternity on campus because she was a woman. And that opened the door for her. And I think at that moment, her most intimate conflicts became her weapon. And over the years, I mean, this didn't happen like the next year. It was over time. She recognized Jane Crow. That's what she called this kind of composite of discriminations, which we now would call intersectionality. And so, that's a long time in the future. So I'm not sure I should go there right now, but she was an absolute perfect example of someone whose conflicts led them to be important pioneers of major social transformations.
Well, I mean, you are saying some things that happened not until the 60s and 70s, even in her own life. I mean, the identification that, I mean, I forget which speech it is that she's attending. I think it's A. Philip Randolph is giving a speech, and the women are kept in a balcony, and she says, you don't understand what is happening here. I mean, that this is replicating the very situation of of Black people riding at the back of the bus. I mean, so she, even in real time, was identifying that and speaking about it. But one of the things that when you point out intersectionality, I mean, what I think is so important about what you say in this book is that there are, not that there are never new conflicts, never not new conflicts, but when people talk about critical race theory, or as if this is all a new understanding and we must guard against it, I mean, the people who are saying we shouldn't teach it, I mean, thoughts like this have been bubbling up, have been expressed for decades, and there are people who long ago recognized this, and these have affected American society for decades and decades. This is not a new 1619 project. From the last 3 years has brought this new crisis, into American life. So that is a very important, I think, thing that your book does. I mean, is to show the many decades of struggle that are behind some of the arguments of today. So
one of the places where that's so clear is with voting rights. We're still talking about voting rights, and when Medgar Evers came home from the war, this is a civil rights chapter. I can't even imagine how he felt when dressed in his uniform with his discharge papers in his hand and medals on his chest, on the bus that's taking him home, forced to sit in the back of the bus. And then when people went inside for lunch, he was made to wait for them on the bus. I mean, this is, somebody who could easily have died for his country from between D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge. And he came home righteously angry about his welcome, which was not unlike other Black soldiers' welcomes. I mean, and he was determined to vote in that election, 1946. No one in Decatur had voted yet. No Black person had ever voted in Decatur. He and his brother came home to start a shooting war against racism in the United States. And that their attempt to vote in that election was turned aside by guns, by white people determined that no Black person should ever vote. And here we are talking about it today. It's not as bad as that, but the fact that we're still talking about it, I mean, Martin Luther King's famous quote, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, could not be truer than what we see about voting rights.
I mean, what's interesting about voting rights is I had not realized that there was a 1944 Supreme Court case that basically said, I mean, I'm not going to necessarily approach it properly from a full legal perspective, but basically said Black people should be allowed to vote. And so there was a huge registration drive, which of course was for naught, because once, the 1946 election and other elections came, Black people who had registered were unable to vote, or their votes were simply, as you say, not counted. I mean, so that I think it's Herman Talmadge, who was running for a third term as governor of Georgia, won, even though there had been a huge turnout in Black districts, which he won somehow because votes were not counted. Yeah. So in many ways, I mean, we are 7 decades later, or 8 decades later, still talking about vote counting.
Yes.
And
right.
Where and when and what votes should be counted and whether votes have been counted. And yet it's not a surprise. I mean, it's not as if we didn't know there were these long routes. One of the things I'd like to ask you about when you talk about Medgar Evers is you talk about the returning veteran. I mean, the story you tell of Isaac Woodard, and then if you could tell a little bit about how you situate that as the roots of the civil rights movement in the 40s, the post-war, and then
Right.
into the 50s. Because Medgar Evers you write about several people and that experience.
Yeah. Isaac Woodard came home from World War II, and he was on his way home on a bus, passing through the Carolinas, when they made a stop for food, and he asked the bus driver, "Could I get off and go to the bathroom?" And the bus driver said no. And Woodard, who was fresh from the war, he'd been in 15 months in the Pacific, basically wouldn't take it anymore and said to the driver, "You talk to me like I'm a man, just like you." Anyway, the bus driver backed off. He went off, he came back, and at the next bus stop, he was met by the police force of Batesburg, which was two people, the chief of police and a deputy. And the driver told him to get off the bus because the police wanted to talk to him. And before he could start talking to the policeman, he hit him in the head with his baton. And there was a series of beatings as he dragged Woodard off to jail. One of them, at some point in the struggle, he ground his baton, the chief of police ground his baton into Woodard's eyes very carefully and very hard. And Woodard was blinded for the rest of his life. That was not the worst of the homecomings that black soldiers received on their way home. But in Woodard's case, it was brought to the attention of Harry Truman by the NAACP. And Truman had been an officer in World War I and was very supportive of both Black and white soldiers. Truman doesn't get quite enough credit for this, but he was the first president ever to campaign in Harlem, for example. And he was truly offended by what had happened to Woodard and called his attorney general and said, look into this because there may be a problem here. And there was a problem there, obviously. But he actually brought charges against the chief of police in Batesburg. And that was unheard of. It was in the courtroom, too, of Judge Wadey's Waring, who was disgusted by this case, because the prosecutor said, the defense lawyer ended up saying, "I'm sorry, I'm just doing this because it's my job," to the jury. So it was Wadey's Waring. For Wadey's Waring, it was a turning point. He helped Thurgood Marshall figure out the argument that would win Brown versus Board of Education, and he made many decisions in the few years he remained in Charleston that were good for civil rights. And he also brought friends who were Black to his house, and it alienated his fellow citizens in Charleston. And his family went back to the 17th century there. And he was buried away from his family when he was finally buried there. But he made a huge difference in civil rights legal history. Going back, the chief of police's trial was itself unbelievable, and it was quite believable that he was also acquitted by an all-white jury. It was totally predictable.
You have a wonderful detail where Waring takes a long walk while the jury is out, just because he knows that the jury is going to come back very quickly with an acquittal, and he makes them wait for the acquittal because he's so outraged by
exactly. And he was disgusted by the verdict, and his wife broke down in tears. She was in the courtroom at the time. The sad thing about Woodard is he never knew that the chief of police had ever been tried. He didn't know anything about Wadey's Waring's future on civil rights. He didn't know that Harry Truman had intervened in his case. he wasn't the. I mean, he was a wonderful man. It turned out. I mean, the people interviewed him in his later life and found him very responsible, very capable, just blind.
How come he was never called to testify? I mean, I guess if the defense attorney, said, "I'm just doing this," I mean, the prosecutor just didn't bring him to testify. I mean,
no, and I'm not sure what the reason was. And somebody, a judge in Charleston named Richard Gergel, just wrote a book about Woodard, and I don't think he answers that question well either.
What you say that Waring, his house was firebombed,
Yeah.
I think in 1952. I mean, and then he moved to New York with his wife, and never went back to Charleston until he was buried. I mean, I don't know if he never visited, but he lived in New York for safety reasons, it sounded like. So, I mean, I wanted to go back, because we talked a little bit about Paulie Murray and feminism. One of the things that's so interesting, she was a co-founder of Now with Betty Friedan. I mean, you have such interesting sort of side comments about Betty Friedan and the way Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique deliberately misread feminist history and even sort of misrepresented her own sort of feminist awakening as if it came, completely out of the blue, and how her book, in writing one history, unwrote in a way another history. And so if you could talk about Betty Friedan and then bring in Gerda Lerner, because I love what you say about her and her work amassing, the history of women and Black women in America and how that is a different history of feminism.
If I could begin sort of in the late 1930s, early 1940s, she was a Jewish young woman from Austria at a time when Austria was being Nazified, and was all but forced out of Austria was lucky enough to get to the United States. There she was sort of, she was rejected by the German community because it was largely anti-Semitic, found herself in the left wing, and basically stayed there for the rest of her life. She had been sympathetic to Russia during the war and listened to Radio Moscow to find out how much worse it was there. I forget what you asked me to segue from Paulie Murray, right?
Oh, to Betty Friedan and then Gerda Lerner, and how different histories of written and needed to be rewritten. I thought you had some. I started this with just asking you to talk about some of the marvelous side comments you make about Betty Friedan, really.
Yeah, well, she acted as if the whole strange stirring thing that she intuited in American society, and acted as if she were surprised by it, and as if she had never really thought about the woman problem before she wrote The Feminine Mystique. And the fact is that after college, her first job was with a labor news service where she wrote about feminism all the time, because there was a feminist movement before, obviously the suffrage movement in the 20s, but it survived through the 30s. It survived and evolved through the 30s. And she was part of that evolution. She was writing for women's magazines about, feminist problems and solutions. And so for her to say, this was the first I knew of feminism, or the first I thought about it, was just simply not true. And
yes, you have her saying something like very categorical, like no woman born after 1920 knows any history of feminism, or for them there is no history of feminism, which
Right.
her own life was a complete repudiation.
Yeah, and that she had never known a woman who used all of her intelligence and senses in behalf of anything other than home and family, which also wasn't true. Even she was a model of the opposite. So I do take on Betty Friedan a bit because she deserved it.
I know it's sort of like the mystique of the feminine mystique that you dispel.
Yeah. Paulie Murray was a co-founder of NOW, but she quit because the movement was so lacking diversity. And Gerda Lerner, who was, for those who don't know, the basically the creator of women's studies, taught the first course in women's history at Sarah Lawrence, the first graduate course in, and then the first doctorate at the University of Wisconsin. And I think that the fact that she read The Feminine Mystique when she was just about to start teaching her first class. And she wrote to Betty Friedan immediately and said, this is a splendid book, but I must say, you missed the fact that we can't afford to forget women who are Black and in other minority communities. And that's something we cannot afford to do. That's a quote. That is something we cannot afford to do. And when she went to the University of Wisconsin, I'm not sure if she was at Sarah Lawrence or Wisconsin, but anyway, she did a book called Writings of Black Women, I think, or Black Women's Writings. It was the first ever compilation of writings by Black women in the United States. And it made a huge difference. I remember Hein Clark, one of her acolytes sat with it for hours. She was also Black, and sat with it for hours just thinking, oh, this opens an incredibly rich terrain. And it did. And it helped Lerner create the women's, all the history professors were saying there's not enough American history of women to justify a separate course, not to mention a discipline. And she set out to prove otherwise with that book, and it did. It led to her being able to start the first women's studies program at Sarah Lawrence, and then the first postgraduate doctoral program at the University of Wisconsin. And I think the most important point about her and it was that she made her doctoral students go out to the communities and do talks, even to primary and secondary schools. And she saw the teaching of feminism as her active feminism and activism in its final form. She'd had many periods and styles of activism before that, but this was the one that really changed things here.
So, we'll go to questions in about 10 minutes, but I want to speak about what you bring in about ecology. You talk about, we've left out a lot of the people that you talk about. Obviously, there are more people in each of these chapters than we've had time to address here. So I urge people not to think that we've synthesized everything tonight. But you do, in the chapter on ecology, have this marvelous sort of pairing, putting in dialogue these two writers who didn't know one another and had very different disciplines, one of whom we know is still very famous. Rachel Carson, who is the kind of ecological writer, and who is well remembered. The other person you talk about is Norbert Wiener, who in his own time was in many ways as famous as she was. And so if you could talk about who he was in particular, and then talk about how you put them in dialogue with one another, because basically what they are both saying, even though they talk about, I mean, he talks mainly about computers and the mechanism of modern life, and she's talking obviously about chemicals and the environment, that the inventions of man have now begun to endanger all life on Earth, and in many ways, whether it's contaminating the environment or just destroying the fabric of human life, that man's inventions, as Norbert Wiener put it, have done that. And then she, similarly, the chemicals that have been invented. So talk about them and about him, because he was, I had never heard of him, although I think many people will know the word that he invented, cybernetics.
Yeah. And the prefix cyber, I mean, that was his word for something that's very difficult to explain in a very short form. But the lashing together of human abilities and human purposes with the ability of mechanisms. This was a time of computer development, so it was all involved in computer development, and the tying together of human abilities with inhuman or non-human abilities, and that's what he called cybernetics. But he was a joke at MIT, even though he was its preeminent mathematician at the time. He was rotund and smoked cigars everywhere he went, and including on his back in the swimming pool, so he could keep smoking his cigar.
I loved that detail. Also, you say he was so, if you waylaid him while he was walking somewhere, he would ask you whether he had been going to or from the cafeteria so that he would know whether he had had lunch. I
mean, right. And he'd usually walk through the halls reading, and with one hand against the wall he was next to, and he would follow that, as when he came to a doorway, he would follow his finger all the way around a classroom and all the way back, and then continue on his way. It was just, he was honestly, I think if he hadn't been so eccentric, he would have been accused, and rightly maybe accused, of being a spy, because he was a great military scientist during World War II, and I think it was the bomb. I mean, I'm sure the bomb had a huge influence on the fact that he refused to do any military work after World War II, because he could see that it was essentially anti-human. But nobody, MIT relied almost exclusively for its radiation laboratory. Later had another name I don't remember right now, but they got their funding from the military. So the fact that he was there and saying the military science was terrible must have been kind of embarrassing, but you could sort of overlook it because he was so eccentric, known to be nuts, as somebody said. But anyway, he wrote a book called Cybernetics, and it was unreadable for most people. It was highly mathematical. And then he wrote one called The Human Use of Human Beings, in which he was absolutely clear about siding with labor, siding with job creation, against many of the things that, what he called it, the Saturday Evening Post was for. And he could very well have been imprisoned, at least as a subversive, for a lot of what he said in that book. And that book began his career as a social critic philosopher. His moral philosophy came to overcome his mathematical innovations. And they were very important to people at the time. Both books were bestsellers, which, I mean, it's hard to imagine for cybernetics, but people called it the equivalent of, I don't know, Principia by Newton. he was also I shouldn't have skipped this. He was an amazing child prodigy. He was speaking Latin, I think, at 5, Latin and Greek at 5, reading English at 3. He graduated from Tufts at 14, and by the age of 19, he had his master's and PhD in the logic of mathematics from Harvard. And then he went to study under Bertrand Russell, whose dissertation, whose most definitive work was criticized in his dissertation. And he waited to hear from Bertrand Russell about this, and Russell wasn't completely kind. And when he got the criticism, he just wrote his own criticism of Bertrand Russell's criticism. And then he studied with John Dewey at Columbia, and then finally, sort of roundabout way, found his way to MIT. But after a while, he became noted more as a social historian and a progressive philosopher than as a mathematician.
I mean, we've not talked about so much, as I said, but I wanted to bring it to a close before we go to Q&A with you talk about Rachel Carson at the end, and you say how she had many reasons not to, and you enumerate various things to do in her work, in Silent Spring, and before that in The Sea Around Us. And I found that just a marvelous kind of note for the whole book, that all of these people that you talk about, and so many people working today, for progress. We haven't even been able to talk about the ways in which progress is not always moving us forward. And there are many ways in which what we read in this book, it's very clear that there is a backlash going on to a lot of the progress that these people helped make.
Still.
But so all of these people had many good reasons not to do what they did, and they still did it. And so that seemed to me to give me an enormous amount of hope, even amid, a dire moment. Did you feel that hope? Or
yes.
Did you come away
yes.
feeling?
Actually, that's why I dedicated the book to my grandchildren. Rachel Carson at the very end of her life made a graduation address to Scripps College in LA or in California, in which she said, "I wish I could tell you that my generation had solved all these problems, but I can't say that. And so it falls to you." And I thought about that when I dedicated the book to my grandchildren, because there's a lot to bemoan about the lack of progress we've made in all of these areas. But the fact of these people and how they combated their own conflicts to win progress suggests to me, and I hope to my grandchildren, that hope is always a good idea. And that it, however bleak things look, progress is probably happening somewhere you don't know it.
I don't think it gives too much away. It is a nonfiction book, so it's not as if there's a surprise ending. It's not a spoiler when I say that I love what you say about you end with the path, not to a more perfect union, not quoting that document, but to a less imperfect union. And that seemed also to be an important note to make about America. A less imperfect union was just a beautiful phrase.
Paulie Murray came to that also as she wrote about the law of civil rights. She came to the belief that America was not as she had originally thought, the home of the brave, land of the free, but it was an idea that could be enacted in the future, that the country had imposed upon itself a challenge that it had yet to meet, but that was the reason it was a country. And I thought that was really beautiful, and it's a way of not excusing the lack of progress that we've made, but of imagining that we will, or we can. It's hard to believe right now, but I think it will happen.
Well, I would say knock wood, but that might disturb our Zoom line on my desk. So I will do it in the abstract. Thank you, Jim, very much. And before we go to questions, I just want to thank you for the book. And it helped me understand so much as I work on my biography of Larry Kramer.
Yeah, I imagine.
The crises that he felt as in the years of the AIDS epidemic. And you talk about the link between legal actions, legal challenges. I mean, you talk about Medgar Evers and his impatience with the NAACP's tactics of legal challenges rather than street action. And what it made me think about anew is that ACT UP, Larry Kramer starts ACT UP with other people in the spring of 1980. Crisis, which by then had was in its almost 6th year, but the Bowers v. Hardwick decision of 1986, which basically, said that sodomy laws are legal and gay people having sex in the privacy of their own bedroom, could be arrested. But I've always felt that was that the street action of the next year had as much grounding in rage over that legal decision as it did in the continuing AIDS crisis. I mean, that's some part of it. So I frame it. So I want to thank you on a personal note for that. But it's a great book, and we'll go to questions from the audience. Thank you. So Joan Hartman asks, does all social change have to come from personal discomfort? Is there no such thing as an abstract sense of what is right?
There is such a thing. I wouldn't go so far as to say all change, but in a time that was as oppressive as the 1950s, and it wasn't oppressive in the extreme, but it was oppressive in the sense that it forced people toward a convention. In harsh ways sometimes, and more so than maybe any other time in American history. And in such a condition, I think that's when individuals with their own conflicts would, there was nobody else to help change things then. I mean, the change was just such it was almost verboten. And so I think it took a special person to break through that. On the other hand, there's a great man theory that politicians start everything, that change begins with changes of the law, after which hearts and minds follow. But I think that misses an earlier moment of change when some solitary individual fighting for their own personhood inspires others and almost can't do anything but try to change things because of who they are and the conflict that they're struggling with.
I suppose. I mean, if there's a legal decision, it's or a law changed, it's often because someone had the idea. It has to be because someone had the idea to do it, or was responding to some outrage or injustice that they saw. So it all begins on that personal level, but there has to be a kind of cascade of things that happen to change minds. And as we see in our own time, it may be the cascade of decades, and then there's a backlash. So it's never, as you say, always going one way. But that leads the impossibility or the leads to another question from Laura. how did the myth of conformity serve the post-World War II society? And were there particular groups behind the propagation of this myth?
Well, there was the iron triangle of corporate, political, and military interests that did enforce a certain degree of conformity. And that certain degree, that the methods of enforcement ranged widely from, from not funding certain university science departments, which weren't cooperating with the military, to, for example, the propagation of DDT after the war, when companies started competing with each other to produce it, and no one had ever done a risk assessment of DDT. That's not true. The Fish and Wildlife Service did do research on the effect of DDT in nature, and no one paid any attention because there was so much money involved in purveying it. And those are just two of many, many examples of how the bureaucracy and political interests and profit motives played an important part in getting people to just quiet down and buy things. I think that's probably the best answer. And it's also Dwight Eisenhower left office saying what he said about the military industrial complex, that, it would lead us to places where we not want to go. And I don't think that has entirely stopped.
Right. There are some other questions. I think we have time for one more question, but there are some very large speculative questions that I don't think we'll have time for. Some of them quite deep that I'm sure you have opinions on. Like, do you think a Voting Rights Act will pass within the next 5 years so everyone can vote? But we will leave that important question to another discussion. I just wanted Doris Abramson to know that I was aware of her question. David Moskowitz is hoping that you can explain how the 50s spawned Joe McCarthy, but it took until 2016 for Donald Trump to be elected president. And so I think that too, you might write a book about each of those topics. Yeah. But Ron Santon asks, like the USA, in the 50s, Australia was noted for intolerance and racism toward Aboriginal people in particular. But there was also social and political prejudice against settlers from Eastern and Southern Europe. This was supported by the main Christian, Jewish, Muslim religions who were against any changes to laws for more tolerance to homosexuality or feminine women's rights. Do you feel that religion was, or still is, a major cause to an obstacle to change, and that many of these problems still exist because of religious opposition?
Yes and no. I think that religion, the thing is, if the word religion covers so many different disciplines, points of view, Buddhism, I think, would generally be credited with not having been a big force against the issues you mentioned. I think I will have to stick with that. I'm actually interested in writing a book about something related to that, but I don't know where I am with it. So it's not like I'm keeping anything back, but. Yes, I do think religion has been an issue, and no, I don't think it's been a monolith.
Well, Ron Santon will have to come back when we have another conversation in a few years about this book you're figuring out about religion, and I hope we will meet at the National Arts Club in person to talk about it when it is published. So thank you, Jim Gaines, and congratulations on the 50s and underground history.
Thank you.
So yes, thank you very much, Jim, and thank you very much, Bill. This was a very thought-provoking discussion, and I can't wait to order the book. Absolutely, thanks to you, the audience, for your participation and your terrific questions. A recording of this event will be on the National Arts Club YouTube channel on tomorrow. And so if you'd like to watch it again, or please share it with your friends. So in closing, I wish everybody a lovely evening. Thank you so much for a wonderful event, and good night.